The theme introduction today, and I'm not very good at this, but the story I have to tell doesn't seem very dramatic to start with. Until I was in the third grade, where it was a long trip to church, and the church where my sister and I were baptized as infants, but we rarely attended because it was closer to an all-weather road. It was a Christian church, and Mom took us to the church for Sunday school at least one summer to their vacation Bible school. When we moved to another farm, we were less than 5 miles from an all-weather road. There was a Methodist church right at the beginning of town. I can remember clearly Mom said as we were going to attend every Sunday. That was the beginning of my lifelong regular church attendance. After moving to Oregon, our family became members of the Albany Methodist Church. I became active in the Methodist Youth Fellowship, and the church there had a strong commitment to international relations and missionary work. The church was one of the support network for an agricultural missionary in Africa, Ira Gillett. When I was in high school, he visited our church, and in a special evening service, he told of his work in Africa and a sermon on his Christian faith. I grew up in a church that never had done an altar call, but I knew they happened in some more Pentecostal churches. But after his sermon, he did an altar call and asked anybody that was inspired by his sermon and his work to come forward. And I, with a couple of other youth, did go forward, and it changed my life. At Oregon State University, the Wesley Foundation was served by pastors who asked us questions about our faith. It was a growing time for me. Our first scripture this morning is Genesis 45, 1-9, and 14 to 15. Then Joseph could no longer control himself before all those who stood by him, and he cried out, "Send everyone away from me." So no one stayed with him. Joseph made himself known to his brothers, and he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard it, and at that time the household of Pharaoh heard it. Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?" Brothers could not answer him, so dismayed were they at his presence. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "Come closer to me." And they came closer. He said, "I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves, because you sold me there. For God sent me to preserve life. For the famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there are 5 more years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvest. God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on earth, and to keep alive for you many survivors. So it was not you who sent me here, but God. He has made me a father to the Pharaoh, and lord of all his house, and ruler over all the land of Egypt. Hurry now and go to my father and say to him, your son Joseph, thus says your son Joseph, God has made me lord of Egypt. Come down to me, do not delay. Then he fell on his brother Benjamin's neck and wept, while Benjamin wept on his neck. And he kissed all his brothers and wept upon them. And after that his brothers talked with him. Stand now for the Alleluia.
In the name of our Creator, Redeemer, and Sustainer. Amen. Quick question. A little bit of trivia, start off. What is the most important story in the Hebrew Bible? The Old Testament. What's the most important story? All of them. That's kind of cheating. It's like all of the above. Is that? Huh? No. I mean, we got this going? Yeah, there we go. Moses. I mean, it's so important that Cecil B. DeMille made it twice. Moses. I mean, if you ask, like, what does it mean to be a Jew? What is a Jew? Like, what's that about? It's the people that God freed from Egypt. They walked through the Red Sea. They went to Mount Sinai and they received the law. They made a covenant with God. I mean, that's like the foundational story that all of this. And when you read the Hebrew Bible like closely, you can tell the people who wrote this Bible and who edited these stories and put them together, like, they all knew that because all of the other stories are kind of littered with the connections to this main core story. Right? I mean, it's the story. I mean, you can kind of say Abraham and his story as well, but I mean, it really all takes place here. Right? Because Abraham had many sons. But the one we remember is Isaac because that's the one who receives the promise and da-da-da-da-da. Okay? So my next question is this. Did Abraham live in Egypt? No. So how do we get to Egypt? Right? How do we get there? The story of Joseph tells us how we got there. Right? Without Joseph, right? There isn't a Moses, there isn't a Red Sea, there isn't a Mount Sinai. That story, or at least those stories, those covenants, those relationships would have been very, 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 very different. Joseph gets us to Egypt. Now, let's review. Abraham and Sarah, that's how we start off. Abraham, God appears to Abraham and makes a covenant with Abraham in Genesis chapter 12. There are 4 things in those covenant. Can anyone who didn't go to seminary tell me what those 4 things are? So those are things, those are kind of, you're getting close. That's one thing. So he had many children. What else? Many children. Be a nation. Nobody? I got a can again. Land and a blessing. Nation. Many children. You went to seminary. Doesn't count. Land. A blessing. One more thing. You have to share this probably. You have to share this, Miranda. He gets the candy because he got the most. He would be a blessing. All through him, all the world would be blessed. All the nations of the world would be blessed. But it's important to remember because, right, all the way through Genesis, what's at stake in pretty much every single story is this covenant. Is it going to be fulfilled? Because do they have kids when they start off? No. How are you going to be a nation? They come to the land. Well, there are people there. How is it going to be their land? How does all this work out? Every single story in Genesis, kind of until you get to Joseph's story, is about that promise and is it going to be fulfilled? How is it going to be fulfilled? Wait a minute, there are obstacles to it being fulfilled, right? So, Abraham and Sarah have Isaac. They also have Ishmael, and Ishmael Sarah doesn't like Hagar, and so they chase Ishmael and Hagar off. Isaac marries Rebekah, and they have Jacob and Esau, whose story we heard, right? We heard all about that last week, right? Jacob is renamed Israel. He sort of receives the promise. The promise comes to him, and he has 12 children, 12 boys. 12 boys by Rachel and Leah, and actually each of their maidservants as well bear him kids. I mean, it's a story of many shenanigans going on. I mean, I'm giving you the briefest overview. The 12 sons, Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Issachar, Zebulun, Joseph, Benjamin. Those are the 12 sons. There are some of the sort of famous people you might recognize who were descendants of their sons. These are the 12 tribes, right? The thing is, again, all this happens here in Canaan. This is where, Abraham is his family's here. He and his father go up here, and his brothers, and most of them stay in Haran. And then Abraham keeps going to the land, Canaan. So, how do we get from here to here? That's what happens next. Jacob and Rachel, they have their sons, right? And we all know about this one. What's his name? Joseph. Joseph has a what? Right, a coat of many colors, or a coat with long sleeves, or ornamental coat. Like, the Hebrew there is just ambiguous enough that, like, what exactly that referring to isn't completely, lots of different interpretations. Now, you think that would be enough, but Joseph is not loved by his brothers. Joseph, being 17 years old, was shepherding the flock with his brothers. He was helper to the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah. That's the other two wives, the handmaidens of Rachel and Leah. His father was, and Joseph brought a bad report of them to their father. He tattles. Joseph's kind of a tattletale. Or he's a goody two-shoes. There are a lot of ways, Now, Israel loved Joseph more than any of the other children because he was the son of his old age, and he made him an ornamented robe or a coat of many colors or whatever, But when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peaceably with him. Shocking. Once Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. He said to them, "Listen to this dream that I dreamed. There we were, binding sheaves in the field," reaping the field and binding it together. "Suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright. Then your sheaves gathered around and bowed down to my sheaf." His brother said to him, "Are you indeed to reign over us? Are you indeed to have dominion over us?" So they hated him even more because of his dreams and his words. There's a story of the younger brother like being the favorite. Cain and Abel, Jacob and Esau. It doesn't end there. He had another dream. And he told it to his brothers, saying, "Look, I've had another dream. The sun, the moon, and 11 stars were bowing down to me." But when he told it to his father and to his brothers, his father rebuked him and said to him, "What kind of dream is this that you have had? Shall we indeed come, I and your mother and your brothers, and bow to the ground before you?" So his brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind. So they decide to kill him. Seems a little drastic, but this is the story. Remember, this is the story. The brothers, they get together. Brothers always seem to be on the verge of killing each other. They get him. He comes out alone. They sort of capture him. And Reuben says, "Let's not kill him just yet. We'll just throw him in a pit for now. Let me go away. I'll come back." So he goes away. While he's away, Judah has a wonderful idea. Well, let's not kill him. Let's just sell him into slavery. Better than death, maybe, for some people. So they sell him to some wandering traders. And where do you think they end up? Egypt. That's how Joseph gets to Egypt. Now, while Joseph is in Egypt, there are many shenanigans. He gets in trouble with the boss, with his boss's wife. He gets thrown in jail. It turns out he can interpret dreams. And there's some people in jail who realize this. And when they get out, they're supposed to remind Pharaoh about this, but they forget. But eventually, basically, Pharaoh starts being disturbed by these dreams. And in the dreams, there are these 7 fat cows and these 7 lean cows. And the lean cows rise up and they eat the fat cows. And then he has another dream where these wonderful 7 sheaves of wheat or heads of wheat, and these 7 terrible ones, and the 7 terrible ones rise up and eat the nice, juicy ones. And Pharaoh's disturbed by this dream, and someone remembers, oh, there's this guy Joseph, he interprets dreams. And so Joseph goes to him, tells him the dream, and says, I know what this is. You're going to have 7 years of plenty and 7 years of famine. So what you need to do is prepare for the years of famine. Take extra grain from all that plenty, put it in a warehouse and keep it so that you will have food and supplies and resources during the 7 years of famine. And and Pharaoh's like, oh, this is a wonderful idea. And I have a feeling all the important sub bosses around were like, yeah, Joseph, why don't you take care of running everything? That way I don't have to stick my neck out. And Pharaoh's like, yes, you do this. And so Pharaoh basically becomes the COO of Egypt. He's like the chief operating officer of Egypt. And he sets up everything and he takes all the plentiful grain, he puts it in these storehouses and gets it ready for the famine. So after the 7 years, the famine comes. And this is where we get the continuing drama of Joseph and his brothers, because it's not just in Egypt where there's a famine. The famine is terrible in Canaan as well. So his brothers hear, along with everybody else, that there's grain in Egypt, and they decide to go and see if they can get relief supplies. Now, our reading this morning that you heard isn't the first trip. It's actually the second trip. And the first one, well, it might not surprise you. In the first one, there are many shenanigans. Because he recognizes them, but they don't recognize him. He sees them and he immediately accuses them of being spies. You just come here, you know there's a famine, you're here to see where our weaknesses are. And so he's to say, I'm going to throw you in jail. And they say, no, we're 12 sons from Canaan, we're all related, we've just come to buy food because of the famine. And Joseph says, 12? I only see 10. Well, the youngest is back with our dad because he really loves him. And the other brother we have is no more. Now, they didn't have to reveal that. That sort of that gives Joseph some leverage in this relationship, right? So he says, no, I think you're spies. I'm going to throw you all in jail except one. One of you is going to go, and when you return with the youngest, I'll give you grain and you can go. And they sit and stew in jail for 3 days. 3 days, I'm just saying 3 days. He finally lets him out. And he says, look, okay, one of you is going to stay here as a hostage. I'll send you all back, but you need to come back with your youngest brother or for the hostage, right? So they say, okay. So he gives them some provisions. He sells them some grain. Secretly, he puts the money that they gave him back into their bags and sends them back to Canaan. Now, what do you think is going through their brother's mind a couple days' journey along when they discover all the money in their bags again? Uh-oh, it's a trick. Right? This guy is going to accuse us of theft, that he put this money back in our bags. So they get there. He just wants an excuse to keel-haul us. Right? So they get to where their father is, right? And they say, look, this is the deal. We're going, we go back to Canaan. They talk to Jacob, Israel, and say, look, it says, they have our brother, Simeon is the one that's left back. We have the brother. They say, we got to bring the other one back. And Jacob's like, look, I've lost one son. Now I've lost another. I'm not sending you all back there. So they say, okay, for a while. The thing is, the famine is bad. Really bad. And so after a while, Judah convinces Jacob to just look, we got to go. We'll take Benjamin. I'll be responsible. If something happens to Benjamin, you can kill me and take all of my family and everything as slaves. So Jacob relents, and they all travel back with Benjamin in tow. And this is it's a long journey. Okay? When they finally get there, Joseph sees Benjamin. He has to leave the room because he's overcome. He's going to break down and weep and wail, and he doesn't want to do that. He finally gets a hold of himself. They give Joseph the money back and more, and they buy more grain. He has dinner with them, and finally, eventually, after all of this hullabaloo, back and forth, he can't hold it back anymore, and he reveals himself to them. And that's where we get this morning's reading. Joseph said to his brothers, "Come closer to me." And they came closer. He said, "I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life. For the famine has been in this land for 2 years, and there are 5 more years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvest. God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to keep alive for you many survivors. So it was not you who sent me here, but God. He has made me a father to Pharaoh and lord of all his house and ruler over all of Egypt. Hurry and go up to my father and say to him, 'Thus says your son Joseph, God has made him lord of all Egypt. Come down to me, do not delay.' Then he fell upon his brother Benjamin's neck and wept, while Benjamin wept upon his neck. And he kissed all his brothers and wept upon him. And after that, his brothers talked with him." It's a very emotional scene. There's been a lot of build-up. There's this whole thing where Joseph hears them talking. They don't understand that he understands, because he's using an interpreter, and they're talking to themselves about what the situation. They're like, "This is our fault, this is a reckoning for what we did to Joseph. We're getting our payback for what we did." And Joseph almost loses it, and he sends them back, and they come back, and he almost loses it again. He goes and hides, and finally he just can't hold on any longer. In this very emotional, this very familial scene, right, this moving back and forth from Canaan to Egypt, finally results in the entire family, Jacob and everybody and all their herds and all of their peoples moving to Egypt into the land of Goshen. Might remember that. That comes up and becomes very important later. Until we get, and they're there for a couple of generations, until we get to the next book of the Bible, Exodus, which begins incredibly ominously. Now a new Pharaoh arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And then we get into that story that we remember from Charlton Heston and the Ten Commandments, right? It's one of the longest stories in all of Genesis, this story of Joseph. One of the longest stories, quite a few chapters long. It's important to the plot because you get Abraham's descendants from Canaan moving to Egypt, and sets up this next big series of events with Moses. But it's also because it's a story about enslavement, about overcoming adversity, of God being with people in difficult situations and circumstances, and of course, when it comes to the brothers, about forgiveness and reconciliation and healing. Because what's interesting here is Joseph doesn't just forgive and forget. I don't know if you noticed that or not. He puts his brothers through some tests. He's willing to forgive. He's willing to let things go. I mean, he could have, as soon as he saw him, put him in jail and then had him executed. He had that power. No one would have questioned it. But he has a certain wisdom, right? That he wants to see if he can trust them or not. He waits to see if they will tell the truth about their family. And they do when they tell him about the youngest brother and that one is no more. They recognize the troubles that they're experiencing or a sort of reckoning of the evil that they've done before. They don't shirk from responsibility. They don't minimize their actions. They don't engage in whataboutisms. Well, what about this or what about that? And they show themselves trustworthy rather than being sort of venal, right? They bring the money back. They bring twice as much to pay for the grain again. They don't try to cheat or use situations to their advantage. At the same time, Joseph does put them through the ringer. There's this whole thing we didn't kind of go over, but there's a whole thing where he actually hides an important silver cup in Benjamin's belongings, and there's this whole sort of acted out drama where basically the one who they say, well, we didn't steal it, we didn't steal anything, we promised. Well, the cup is missing. Well, you can kill and enslave anyone who has the cup, and then they discover it in Benjamin's sack, right? And Joseph does all this. He hides the money, he hides the cup, and you could say that seems to be going a bit too far. This story is very messy. It's a lot more messy than, Joseph and the Technicolor Dreamcoat. It's not a musical. It's a family drama. The characters are complicated. It's very, very messy. Forgiveness and reconciliation is also very, very messy. Forgiveness is one thing. And when I think of forgiveness, I think of letting go of the desire to punish someone. Letting go of the desire to see someone suffer for something that they did or said or whatever. That's something one person can do. Forgiveness, it can be hard, but it really is just the first step to reconciliation and to healing. For that to happen, both sides have to be involved. The truth of what happens needs to be told from both sides. Injury and hurt has to be acknowledged. Trust has to be earned. For a healing of relationships to happen, trust has to be earned. It has to be given. And then healing can happen. Because a lot of people can work for trust and you just never give it to them. You can withhold it because you're not really forgiving them. It's not cut and dried. It's very messy. It's often way too easy to sabotage reconciliation, by not giving trust, by bringing up past errors and wielding them as a cudgel. That's not working towards healing. Whataboutisms. What about this? What about that? Well, you did this. Well, what about this thing that you did? Well, what about the thing that you did? Well, what about the thing? It never ends. It never ends. Jesus said you're worried about the mote in your brother's eye and not the log in your own. I want to say the mote in my eye. It's the log that's in your eyes. Let's talk about the log. We'll take care of the mote later, right? It can happen. Healing, reconciliation can happen, but it must be both parties. It took Joseph and his brothers. It took Jacob finally returning, finally letting go of his fear, his terror of losing his sons. It took Joseph's weeping at the suffering his brothers were going through to see them as human beings. That's what it took for this reconciliation between them to happen. It's really interesting to read the Bible study that we've been doing because we're right in the middle of this story in the Bible study that we're doing in Genesis. How much negative feelings came up about Joseph, because Joseph is kind of a hero in this and he's often seen as the hero, but Joseph sort of like vanity early on. You understand why his brothers hated him. And it's kind of cruelty to the way that he treated his brothers later. Right? Reconciliation, forgiveness is a recognition that we are broken people in a broken world and nobody's hands comes out clean. We are all in this thing together. To forgive as we have been forgiven is not to set up another quid pro quo, tit for tat kind of a system. It's to acknowledge that our lives are intertwined. And we all have healing and forgiving to give and to receive. Life isn't black and white. It isn't black hats and white hats fighting out. It's not the Allies and the Nazis. These stories in the Bible that we read, that we think are just these pure morality plays, they're not black and white either. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, David, if you take time to read, to put it kindly, they had complicated relationships with God. That's to be generous. They're not simply the good guys. They're not the guys that, we saw on the flannel boards when we were kids, Brings me to a quick comment I want to make about what's going on in Israel and Palestine. It's just this. You don't have to pick a side. You don't have to pick a side. It's not simply, I'm not talking about like fence sitting, and I'm certainly not saying throwing your hands up and saying a pox on both your houses. Remain engaged as you feel you should, but you don't have to pick a side. There are not simply good guys and bad guys in the long unfolding of this violent relationship or the cruelties that have been visited on both sides. Actions and reactions can be understandable without being justified. We can understand why someone would do something without condoning it or seeking to justify it. So far, I don't I haven't seen much that can be justified that's unfolded in these last few weeks or these last many years. We live in a world that wants to divide us and put us on one side or the other, black or white. Who do you endorse? Who do you condemn? Joseph or his brothers, the younger son or the older, Jacob or Esau, Ishmael or Isaac, Cain or Abel. We're not 5 years old anymore. We know our heroes have clay feet. If you don't know your heroes very well. We should know by now that the world is more complicated, human beings are more complicated, that we are capable of great generosity and compassion and selfishness and cruelty. All of us. And that is both the why and the how of forgiveness and reconciliation. That rather than pointing fingers, screaming blame and outrage, losing our humanity as we dehumanize others, we have to see the other in ourselves and ourselves in the other. Caring for the other as we would ourselves. Even those who have hurt us. Jesus says, and this is probably the hardest thing he ever said, we kind of undermine it by making it a cliche. Love your enemies. Do good to those who persecute you. Because it is only when we can see God and ourselves in our enemy that we can truly love and accept ourselves. That might be the hardest thing that a human being can do. God help us, because we need it. Amen.